As we float around on this little blue ball in the middle of space, it should make you feel really good to know that there have been times in history where decisions were made that could have just killed us all. And these decisions were made, of course, without your knowledge, without my knowledge, without anybody's knowledge, except those who are directly involved with the decision. And today, we're going to go over times when decisions were made that could have wiped out the entire human race. In the late 1960s, during the height of this space race, we sent Apollo 11 to the moon with 3 astronauts inside. Now, we're pretty familiar with the way that the moon landings work, as we've seen them on TV. We know it from history. Basically, we shoot them up, they land on the moon, do their thing, come back down. But when we sent the Apollo 11 missions up, there was actually a protocol put into place because we weren't sure what they were going to encounter up there. There were 2 things that NASA was concerned about. First was forward contamination, which would be us contaminating the surface of the moon. The reason why this was a concern was because NASA didn't want it to put a false positive for finding alien life in future missions. Now, the back contamination was another concern. We didn't know what they were going to be encountering up there. We didn't know if they were going to find weird alien microbes that burst out of our chest or gave a crazy disease where arms and legs grew out of our faces. Like, they didn't know what they were going to find up there. So because of these concerns, NASA put in several quarantine measures in place in these cases where the astronauts were to return. They were going to put them in a 3-week quarantine. They were not allowed to speak or talk to anybody without that quarantine being in place. They were not even allowed to hug their families or anything like that. So when the astronauts returned from their space mission on the moon, they landed in the middle of the ocean. Now, for some reason, the protocols that NASA put in place for the quarantine didn't consider this. So when the officials arrived to go pick up the astronauts from the lander in the middle of the ocean, they didn't consider that the astronauts would be really uncomfortable in there. They were tired, they were hot, they just returned from the moon, they were splashing around on the waves, so they were probably being sick in there. So the decision was made to open the door. The rescuers wore contamination suits, and they also entered the quarantine facility as soon as they got the astronauts off. But opening the hatch was a decision that literally could have killed us all. Fortunately for the Apollo 11 mission, it didn't bring back any facesuckers or weird alien diseases. But if it had, that decision to prioritize the short-term comfort of the men in that space capsule could have released any contaminations into the ocean during that brief window and killed us all. "24 years earlier, scientists and officials within the government stood at a turning point that involved a very small but potentially very dangerous risk. Before the first atomic weapons test in 1945, scientists performed calculations that pointed to something awful. In the scenario that they plotted out, the heat from a fission explosion would be so great that there was a chance that it could cause a runaway fusion. So what that means that in the test that they were going to run, it might accidentally set the atmosphere on fire and burn away the oceans, destroying almost all of the life on Earth. Now, of course, they did studies and they suggested that it was probably most likely impossible. But right up until the day of the test, the scientists were checking and rechecking and double-checking their analysis just in case, because the day of the test had finally came. And they decided to just go ahead with it. When the flash was longer and brighter than they had expected, One member of the team thought that the worst had happened. It had ignited the atmosphere. We were all going to die. Not only did he have the confidence that the bomb would work, but when it did, he believed that they had botched it so hard that there was a disastrous consequence and that he was literally witnessing the end of the world at that point. So despite the scientists absolutely freaking out about this real possibility, there was no peer reviews of the papers, and it seemed that the government was pretty disinterested in what the scientists had to say. There was no evidence that any elected officials were told about the risk, let alone any governments. The scientists and the military literally went in on their own and made this decision.